On the 28th of November 1994, a 6-year-old boy named Ricky Neve left his home on the Welland estate in Peterborough and walked toward school, exactly as he did every morning. He never arrived. His naked body was found the following day, strangled, in a small patch of woodland close to his own front door, posed in a manner so deliberate and so disturbing that it would haunt investigators, journalists, and the wider public for the better part of 3 decades. What followed was one of the most notorious unsolved murder cases in modern British criminal history, a case that would first see an innocent mother wrongly cast in the public imagination as her own son's killer, before finally, 28 years later, forensic science caught up with the truth and delivered justice for a little boy who had been failed, in one way or another, by almost every system meant to protect him. Ricky Neve was born on the 4th of March, 1988, and spent his short life on the Welland estate, a residential area of Peterborough, Cambridgeshire, that in the early 1990s carried a reputation, fair or not, as one of the tougher corners of the city. He was the youngest in a family that had already known considerable strain and hardship. His mother, Ruth Neve, was a mother of 4, raising her children in circumstances that, even before the events of November 1994, had already drawn the attention of social services. Ricky himself was described by those who knew him as cheeky, chatty, and full of life. A boy who could not stop making people laugh, according to his own mother's later description of him. A child bursting with the kind of ordinary, exuberant energy that 6-year-olds bring into any household lucky enough to have them. On the morning of the 28th of November 1994, Ricky was seen leaving the Welland estate, heading in the direction of a nearby wooded area, a patch of trees and undergrowth known locally simply as the woods, a place children in the estate used as an informal playground, complete with a den that local kids had built and used for their own games. He was seen that morning in the company of another boy from the estate, a 13-year-old named James Watson, the two of them walking together toward the trees. It would be the last time Ricky Neve was ever seen alive. When Ricky failed to arrive at school and failed to return home that evening, a search began, and by the following day, the worst possible outcome had been confirmed. Ricky's body was discovered in the woods near the Welland estate, close to the same children's den that local kids, including Watson himself, were known to frequent. He had been strangled, throttled from behind using either a ligature or the collar of his own anorak, and his body had been stripped naked and deliberately posed in a star shape, arms and legs spread outward, positioned with obvious intent close to the den, in what investigators would come to understand as a form of deliberate exhibition rather than any attempt at concealment. The nature of the crime scene itself spoke to something far more disturbing than an act of impulsive, disorganized violence. Whoever had killed Ricky had not simply attacked him and fled. They had taken the time afterward to undress him completely, to arrange his small body in a specific symbolic pose, and to leave him in a location where he would very likely be found by other children from the estate who used that same woodland den for play. This was not the behavior of someone panicking in the aftermath of violence. It reflected, investigators would eventually come to understand, a calculated act carried out to fulfill what would later be described in court as a morbid fantasy. One that the killer had, remarkably, spoken about to another person only days before Ricky's death. The case exploded into national headlines almost immediately. A shocking, deeply unsettling story that gripped the country's attention at a moment when Britain's collective anxiety about violence against children was already running unusually high. Ricky's murder came only 18 months after the killing of 2-year-old James Bolger, a case that had already forced the country to confront, in the most painful terms imaginable, the reality that children could be capable of extreme violence against other children. Against that backdrop, the murder of Ricky Neve landed with a particular, magnified horror. Another child, dead in circumstances that seemed to defy easy explanation, in a case that would go on to consume investigators for far longer than almost anyone could have anticipated at the time. In the earliest days of the investigation, suspicion turned toward the person closest to Ricky, his own mother, Ruth Neve. Cambridgeshire police, working within the context of a household already known to social services and already carrying a difficult reputation within the local community, focused their initial efforts on Ruth as the prime suspect in her own son's murder. She was charged and stood trial at Northampton Crown Court in October of 1996, nearly 2 years after Ricky's death, facing the accusation that she had killed her own young son. The trial exposed disturbing details about Ruth Neve's personal life and interests that, whatever their relevance to the actual crime, were seized upon by prosecutors and press alike as circumstantial evidence suggesting a disturbing state of mind. It was claimed in court that Ruth had an interest in witchcraft, and extraordinarily, that she had been in the process of writing a book on the subject of the perfect murder. Details that, presented to a jury already primed by the horror of the crime itself, painted a portrait of a woman capable of exactly the kind of calculated violence that had been inflicted on her son. Despite this deeply unsettling portrayal, and despite the intense public scrutiny surrounding the case, the jury at Northampton Crown Court returned a unanimous verdict, not guilty. Ruth Neve was formally cleared of murdering her son in October 1996. She did not walk away from the courtroom entirely without consequence. However, Ruth Neve admitted to charges of child cruelty relating to her care of her children, and was sentenced to 7 years in prison on that basis, a conviction connected to the broader neglect and hardship present in the household, but entirely separate from the question of who had actually killed Ricky. For Ruth Neve, this meant enduring not only the devastating loss of her 6-year-old son, but years spent as the primary public suspect in his murder, publicly acquitted of the killing itself, and yet still marked, in the eyes of a great many people who had followed the case through newspaper headlines, as someone who might have gotten away with murder. She would later describe the years that followed in the starkest possible terms, saying that Ricky's murder had rippled out through her life like stones dropped into a pond, leaving her feeling as though her heart had been ripped out, and revealing that she had not seen her other 3 children since her son's death, her family fractured entirely by both the tragedy itself and the wrongful suspicion that had fallen upon her in its aftermath. With Ruth Neve acquitted and no other suspect formally charged, Ricky Neve's murder became, in the years that followed, a cold case, one that Cambridgeshire police were unable to close, despite the enormous public attention the killing had originally generated. Crucially, however, one individual had been present in the earliest stages of the investigation, and had, remarkably, largely escaped serious, sustained scrutiny for more than 2 decades. The same 13-year-old boy who had been seen walking with Ricky toward the woods on the morning of his death, James Watson. Watson was, in fact, spoken to by police as a witness at the time of the original 1994 investigation, precisely because he had been seen with Ricky on the day he disappeared. But whatever account Watson gave to police in those initial interviews went, in the language later used by investigators, unchallenged, and he was not treated as a serious suspect in the years that followed. This is one of the most striking and troubling elements of the entire case. The person who would eventually be convicted of Ricky's murder had been in direct contact with police from the very earliest days of the investigation, had given an account of his own movements and knowledge that was, in hindsight, riddled with lies, and yet had managed to remain outside the frame of serious suspicion for more than 20 years. Part of the explanation for how Watson evaded scrutiny for so long lies in details about his own troubled background that emerged only later, once he had finally become the focus of renewed investigation. At the time of Ricky's murder, 13-year-old James Watson was himself living in a children's home in the Woodgate area, having already accumulated a concerning history of behavioral and criminal issues. Perhaps most disturbingly, Watson had, at the age of 11, sexually assaulted a 5-year-old boy, an offense that had already brought him to the attention of police well before Ricky's murder, and one that spoke to an established, deeply troubling pattern of predatory behavior toward much younger children. Watson's sexual interest in younger boys was, in fact, already known to police at the time Ricky was killed, having been the subject of a prior investigation into an allegation that he had molested a 5-year-old child in 1993, only a year before Ricky's death. Despite this alarming history, Watson was not treated with the level of suspicion that, in hindsight, his background might have warranted. It would take a technological revolution in forensic science, one that simply did not exist at the time of the original investigation, to finally connect Watson definitively to the murder he had committed as a 13-year-old boy. The investigation into Ricky Neve's death was formally reopened in 2015, following what police described as a detailed review of the original cold case files, more than 20 years after the killing had first occurred. This renewed effort focused on physical evidence that had been collected at the time of the original 1994 investigation, but which had simply not been analyzable using the forensic technology available in the mid-1990s. Ricky's clothes, which had been stripped from his body and discarded by his killer, had been recovered by the original investigation team and dumped, according to some accounts, in a wheelie bin near the crime scene. Fibre samples had been taken from these clothes back in 1994, preserved as part of the original evidence file. But the DNA testing techniques of that era were simply not sensitive or advanced enough to extract a usable genetic profile from whatever biological material those samples might contain. That changed by the time of the 2015 cold case review. Advances in forensic DNA analysis over the intervening 2 decades finally made it possible to test the preserved fiber samples from Ricky's clothing using techniques that had not existed at the time of the original crime. When this new analysis was carried out, it revealed the presence of 2 distinct genetic profiles on the samples. Ricky's own DNA, unsurprisingly, and alongside it, the DNA of James Watson, the boy who had walked with Ricky into the woods on the morning he died, and who had never previously been meaningfully connected to the crime through any physical evidence at all. This DNA breakthrough transformed the entire trajectory of the case. James Watson, by then 36 years old, and living an ordinary adult life more than 2 decades removed from the 13-year-old boy who had once been briefly questioned as a witness, was arrested in 2016 on suspicion of Ricky's murder. He was subsequently released on bail, while the Crown Prosecution Service considered whether the DNA evidence, however significant, was sufficient on its own to support a murder charge against him. Remarkably, prosecutors initially concluded that there remained insufficient evidence to bring Watson to trial, a decision that, understandably, caused enormous distress to Ricky's family, who had waited more than 2 decades for any meaningful progress in the case, only to see the investigation stall once again at the point of finally identifying a credible suspect. It was only after Ruth Neve and Ricky's sisters exercised their right, under the Victim's Right to Review scheme, to formally challenge the initial decision not to prosecute, that the Crown Prosecution Service reversed its position and agreed to proceed with charges against James Watson. The case finally came to trial at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court, nearly 30 years after Ricky Neve's death. Prosecutors laid out for the jury a case built not around a single, definitive piece of evidence, but around what one senior Crown prosecutor would later describe as a jigsaw puzzle, with each individual piece of evidence insufficient on its own. but together creating a clear and compelling picture of why James Watson had to be the killer. At the center of that jigsaw sat the DNA evidence itself, Watson's genetic profile found on the clothes Ricky had been wearing before his killer stripped and discarded them. When confronted with this evidence, Watson offered an explanation, claiming that he had picked Ricky up at some point that day so that the younger boy could see over a wooden fence at some construction diggers working on a nearby site. An entirely innocent explanation, if true, for how his DNA might have transferred onto Ricky's clothing through nothing more than an ordinary, incidental moment of childhood interaction. There was, however, a significant problem with this account. Watson had never mentioned this supposed fence-climbing incident to police at any point during his original 1994 interviews, nor during further questioning in 2015 when he was first confronted with the new DNA findings. He only offered this explanation after learning that police possessed new evidence against him and apparently guessing, correctly, that it likely related to DNA analysis. Compounding the implausibility of his account still further, investigators were able to establish, using photographs taken in 1994, that no such fence had actually existed at the location in question at the time of Ricky's murder. The fence Watson described had only been constructed years later. Beyond the DNA evidence and Watson's shifting, increasingly implausible explanations for it, prosecutors presented the jury with additional details that helped establish both a timeline for the murder and a disturbing window into Watson's state of mind in the days immediately preceding it. Investigators had determined, based on the contents of Ricky's stomach, that his last meal had consisted of Weetabix, evidence that helped fix his time of death at approximately noon on the 28th of November. A timeline consistent with Ricky having been killed shortly after he was seen walking with Watson toward the woods that morning. Further physical evidence, in the form of mud found on Ricky's Clark's shoes, indicated that his walk into the woods that day had been a one-way trip, that he had entered the woodland but had never walked back out again under his own power. Perhaps most chilling of all was evidence presented to the court regarding a conversation Watson was said to have had just 3 days before Ricky's murder, on Friday, the 25th of November, 1994, in which he described to his own mother a morbid fantasy he wished to act out. A detail that prosecutors argued demonstrated clear premeditation, that Watson had not killed Ricky in some sudden, unplanned burst of impulsive violence, but had instead been harboring and articulating specific violent intentions in the days leading up to the murder itself. Further testimony offered the court a deeply disturbing window into Watson's ongoing psychological state in the years following Ricky's death, evidence that suggested his violent fixations had not ended with the murder itself. A former girlfriend of Watson's told the court that, on a separate occasion entirely unconnected to Ricky's case, Watson had strangled her during a sexual encounter in woods and had also killed a bird on that occasion, spreading out its wings afterward in a manner that closely mirrored the specific, deliberate posing of Ricky's own body in a star shape years earlier. This testimony, if accepted by the jury, suggested that Watson had, in the years since Ricky's murder, continued to enact variations of the same violent, sexually charged scenario, effectively reconstructing elements of his original crime against Ricky through different victims and circumstances. Taken together, this accumulation of evidence, the DNA on Ricky's clothing, the implausible and shifting explanation Watson offered for its presence, the timeline established through Ricky's last meal and muddy shoes, the disturbing conversation about a morbid fantasy days before the killing, and testimony regarding Watson's apparent later reconstruction of elements of the crime, persuaded an Old Bailey jury of Watson's guilt, after deliberating for 36 hours and 31 minutes, an extraordinarily lengthy deliberation reflecting the weight and complexity of the largely circumstantial case before them. The jury found James Watson guilty of murdering Ricky Neve by a majority verdict in April of 2022, nearly 28 years after the killing itself had taken place. At his sentencing hearing, held at the Old Bailey in June 2022, the presiding judge, Mrs. Justice McGowan, confirmed the full disturbing details of how Ricky had died. Watson had lured 6-year-old Ricky into the woods near his home and had throttled him from behind using either a ligature or the collar of his own anorak, with enough force that marks from the metal teeth of the coat's zip were left imprinted on Ricky's skin, physical evidence of the sheer violence involved in the strangulation itself. After killing Ricky, Watson had stripped his small body and posed it in a star shape, positioned deliberately near the children's woodland den, an act the court determined had been carried out specifically for Watson's own sexual gratification, and one which involved deliberately exhibiting Ricky's body in a location where it was very likely to be discovered by other children from the estate. Because Watson had been only 13 years old at the time he committed the murder, the law required that his sentence reflect his age at the time of the offense, rather than his age at the point of conviction nearly 3 decades later. Mrs. Justice McGowan sentenced Watson, by then 41 years old, to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 15 years to serve before he could be considered for parole, a sentence calculated according to the sentencing guidelines applicable to a 13-year-old offender, reflecting the unusual and legally complex nature of prosecuting a crime committed in childhood but not resolved until adulthood, decades later. Following his conviction, police officers involved in the case did not hold back in their characterization of James Watson. He was described by investigating officers as a fantasist and a compulsive liar who had shown no remorse whatsoever throughout the entire process, from his original misleading statements given as a 13-year-old witness in 1994, through his shifting and ultimately implausible explanations offered decades later once confronted with DNA evidence, to his continued denial of guilt throughout his trial at the Old Bailey. Ruth Neve herself, in a witness statement read to the court, described Watson in the starkest possible terms as pure evil, with no conscience. Watson did not accept his conviction without challenge. He mounted an appeal against the verdict, arguing through his legal team that the case against him had been fundamentally circumstantial, and that a wholesale loss and destruction of evidence over the decades between the original 1994 investigation and his eventual 2022 trial meant that a genuinely fair trial had not been possible. This argument found some initial traction. Appeal judges granted Watson leave to formally challenge his conviction, acknowledging that his grounds for appeal were, in their assessment, arguable. However, when the full appeal was eventually heard in 2023, 3 Court of Appeal judges, Lord Justice Holroyd, Mr. Justice Morris, and Judge Angela Morris, ultimately rejected Watson's challenge, ruling that his appeal had failed and must be dismissed, confirming his murder conviction as final and leaving his life sentence, with its minimum 15-year term standing. Claire Forstyke, a senior Crown prosecutor with the Crown Prosecution Service, spoke after Watson's conviction about the profound significance of finally securing justice in a case that had remained unsolved for so long, describing the conviction as concluding an appalling unsolved crime almost 30 years after it had first occurred, and stating plainly that it finally brought justice for Ricky himself. She emphasized the painstaking, incremental nature of how the case against Watson had ultimately been built, comparing the accumulated evidence to a jigsaw puzzle in which no single piece, taken on its own, would have been sufficient to secure a conviction, but which, assembled together over the course of a lengthy and complex investigation, created a picture clear and compelling enough to finally identify Watson as Ricky's killer beyond any reasonable doubt. For Ruth Neve, the conviction of James Watson, brought a form of vindication that had been decades in coming. A definitive answer, at long last, to the question of who had actually killed her son. An answer that had nothing whatsoever to do with the wrongful suspicion that had haunted her ever since her own 1996 acquittal. And yet, that vindication arrived only after she had already spent the better part of 30 years living with both the devastating loss of her 6-year-old son and the public suspicion that she herself might have been responsible for his death. Years during which, by her own account, she remained estranged from her surviving children, her family fractured by a tragedy compounded, again and again, by decades of unresolved uncertainty about who had truly been responsible. Ricky's eldest sister, Rebecca Maria Harvey, broke down while addressing the court during the sentencing hearing. A raw, visible expression of grief that had been carried by Ricky's family across nearly 3 decades of waiting for the truth to finally emerge. The delay in achieving that justice, the 28 years that separated Ricky's murder from his killer's eventual conviction, stands as one of the starkest illustrations in modern British criminal history of just how significantly advances in forensic DNA technology have transformed the pursuit of justice in cases that would otherwise have remained permanently unsolved. Evidence collected and carefully preserved at a crime scene in 1994, sitting dormant for more than 20 years until scientific advancement finally allowed it to speak, definitively, decades after the crime itself had taken place. What endures in the aftermath of this long and painful case is the memory of who Ricky Neve actually was before his death. A cheeky, chatty 6-year-old boy, full of energy and humor, described by his own mother as someone who could not stop making people laugh. His murder and the extraordinary 28-year journey required to finally bring his killer to justice stands as a profound and sobering reminder of both the devastating vulnerability of young children to predatory violence and the extraordinary, decade-spanning patience required of a justice system determined not to let time alone shield a killer from accountability, however long that accountability ultimately takes to arrive. It is worth taking a longer, more considered look at the specific factors that allowed James Watson to remain outside the frame of serious suspicion for so many years, because the answer to that question reveals a great deal about the limitations of criminal investigation in the era before advanced DNA profiling became widely available. In 1994, Watson was interviewed as a witness rather than treated as a suspect, largely on the strength of an account he gave police that went, by later admission, entirely unchallenged. This is a critical detail, because it illustrates just how much any investigation of this kind depends on the tools available to investigators at the time. Without physical evidence directly implicating Watson, and without any established pattern of behavior connecting a 13-year-old witness to the specific violence inflicted on Ricky, police in 1994 had little practical basis on which to pursue him more aggressively as a suspect. Despite his troubling history of sexual offending against younger children, a history that, whether or not it was fully known to the original investigating officers, does not appear to have been sufficiently weighted against his status as merely a witness who had been seen with Ricky that morning. This gap between what was known about Watson's troubling background and how seriously that background was weighed against him during the original investigation speaks to a broader and more uncomfortable truth about how child sexual offending was understood and responded to in the mid-1990s. Watson's assault on a 5-year-old boy at the age of 11, and the subsequent investigation into an allegation that he had molested a 5-year-old child in 1993 represented, in hindsight, glaring warning signs of an established and deeply concerning pattern of behavior. And yet, in the context of the original 1994 murder investigation, these prior concerns evidently did not translate into Watson being treated as a serious suspect in Ricky's death. a young offender's troubling history apparently insufficient, on its own, to overcome the absence of any direct physical evidence connecting him to the crime. It took, in the end, not any renewed scrutiny of Watson's established pattern of behavior, but rather a purely technological breakthrough. The advancement of forensic DNA analysis to a level of sensitivity simply unavailable in 1994 to finally connect him definitively to Ricky's murder. This raises a difficult and important question that extends well beyond the specifics of this single case. How many other historical investigations, conducted at a time when forensic science remained comparatively limited, might similarly benefit from a renewed examination, using techniques that did not exist at the time the original crime was committed? Ricky Neve's case stands as one of the clearest possible illustrations of the value of maintaining and revisiting cold case files over extended periods of time, preserving physical evidence not because investigators at the time can make immediate use of it, but because future advances in forensic science may eventually render that evidence capable of delivering answers that remain permanently out of reach using the tools of the present moment. The wrongful suspicion that fell upon Ruth Neve in the years immediately following her son's murder also deserves careful, sustained reflection, because it illustrates a recurring and troubling pattern in cases involving the deaths of children, the tendency of both investigators and the wider public to look first, and often most intensely, toward a parent, particularly a mother, especially in circumstances where that parent's household has already attracted concern from social services or other official bodies. Ruth Neve's household, by her own later account, and by the broader circumstances presented at her 1996 trial, was one that had already experienced considerable hardship and difficulty. Factors that, however unrelated they may have been to the actual circumstances of Ricky's murder, appear to have contributed to her being cast so quickly and so publicly as the prime suspect in her own son's death. The details raised at her trial regarding an interest in witchcraft and an alleged manuscript concerning the perfect murder illustrate just how readily circumstantial, character-based evidence can be woven into a compelling narrative of guilt, particularly when a jury and a watching public are already primed by the horror of a crime to seek an explanation that makes some kind of narrative sense. That a unanimous jury ultimately acquitted Ruth Neve, rejecting this narrative entirely, stands as an important vindication of the fundamental principle that a prosecution must be built on solid evidence rather than character assassination or circumstantial suggestion, however dramatic or seemingly damning that circumstantial material might appear when presented in isolation. And yet, that acquittal came only after Ruth Neve had already endured years of public suspicion, a trial in which the most private and vulnerable aspects of her life had been dissected in open court, and a subsequent prison sentence for an entirely separate offense of child cruelty that, however serious in its own right, had nothing whatsoever to do with who had actually killed her son. The 28-year gap between Ricky's murder and James Watson's eventual conviction also illustrates something important about the evolving role of victims' families within the criminal justice process itself. When the Crown Prosecution Service initially concluded, even after the DNA match had been established in 2015, that there remained insufficient evidence to charge Watson, it was Ruth Neve and Ricky's own sisters who took the crucial step of invoking their formal right under the Victims' Right to Review scheme to challenge that decision. Had they not done so, it is entirely possible that James Watson might never have faced trial at all, despite the DNA evidence connecting him directly to Ricky's clothing, and despite the deeply troubling pattern of behavior that had characterized his life both before and after the murder. This detail underscores just how much the eventual delivery of justice in this case depended not simply on the passive application of new forensic technology, but on the active, sustained persistence of a grieving family who refused to accept an initial decision that would have left their son's murder permanently unresolved. Ricky Neve's case, considered in its totality, stands as one of the most significant and instructive cold cases in modern British criminal history. A story that spans the limitations of 1990s forensic science, the devastating human cost of wrongful public suspicion falling upon an innocent mother, the troubling gaps that allowed a known juvenile sex offender to avoid serious scrutiny for decades, despite being present at the scene of a child's murder, and the eventual, hard-won triumph of persistent forensic re-examination, combined with the family's refusal to let the case simply fade into permanent obscurity. It is, above all else, the story of a 6-year-old boy whose life was taken from him in the most calculated and disturbing of circumstances, and whose memory, at long last, received the acknowledgement of formal justice only after nearly 3 full decades had passed, a length of time that no verdict, however definitive, can ever fully make right for the family left behind to carry his loss for the rest of their own lives.